Hello everyone, welcome to my tutorial. Today's tutorial I'm going to talk about the Spring controller. So let's say a use case where we are going to type this http localhost port 8080 and then at the root. So whenever we are typing this at the root, it's going to call a controller which is a login controller, and then this login controller will be rendering the view to the login.jsp, and then the login.jsp will be something like this, that we have a username and password. So when we submit, it should be mapped to another controller which is a member list controller, and we'll be rendering that to the member list.jsp. Okay, so this is what it is. So whenever we are going to make this request, so the first one is a get request, and the second one will be a post request. In the post request, we are passing on this information, and in the get request, we are just calling at the root. So this controller will be invoked. And remember that both of these controller, the login controller and member list controller, these are being controlled by the DispatcherServlet. Now let's go and look into the code, how it looks like. So the code will be something like this. This is just in the PowerPoint. So whenever we are making something as a controller, we define this with the annotation controller, and then we are telling the public class login controller, and then there are some few other annotations, request mapping, and then there is a value, and then it's saying like what the type of the request. And then we can see some other stuff like model and view. Okay, so now let's see that login controller is defined as controller mapped with default \path, accepts a get request, and then returns a model view object which holds model and view in the web MVC framework. Now if we look at the code, this is the code looks like. Again, this is the annotation. This is another annotation with the request mapping. We are saying like where to look for it, and this is telling that what kind of request it is, and then it is accepting the HTTP servlet request and response, and then we are passing on. So this is another object, model and view, and this model and view object is taking the information regarding the view, which is login.jsp, and we are attaching a new empty user over here, and then returning this model and view object, which is over here as returned as mv. So whenever we return this information is rendered into the login.jsp, and you can see that over here we are saying like model attribute is user. Over here you can see that we have defined this as a user. Okay, so we are passing on this user object. So over here model attribute is user, which is the instance of the user, and then we are calling the action to be member list. So now that means that we are invoking the member list controller. Okay, and this is a post method. We are accepting the username and password. So now whenever we are clicking on this form, let's look into this. So whenever, let's say username is A and password is A, and then when I'm submitting it, it's moving on to member list. Okay, so you can see that the list of the members are being showed into the web page. So now member list controller is defined where, if we go over here, member list controller.java, and we can see that over here we have the member list. Okay, so the path is towards the member list, and it is accepting the post method, and the model attribute that we are receiving is the user, and then we are getting the value from the user. Okay, so you can see over here, this is an exception, list member, member list, and then model and view, and then we are saying that okay, this is what the view will be. So in this case it is member list.jsp, and then we are passing on the member list which we receive from over here. Okay, so that's all about the controllers, and remember that there are some service layer and the data layer. The service layer is pretty simple. So if we go over here, this is the service layer, member list, member service, and then we can see that auto wired member service, and we talked about the auto wired before, what this annotation is. So if we go member service, we can look here that the service has defined, this is an interface, and this interface is defining so many other methods. Okay, and we are interested about, let's say, we are interested about retrieve member list. So if we go over here, retrieve member list, okay, so this is the one that we are invoking, and then from the service layer we can go to the data layer, but before that there is an implementation, and let's look into this implementation. So if we go over here, service, member service, and then member service IMPL, and then retrieve member list. Okay, so if we look at the retrieve member list, we can see that it is invoking the DAO layer. So for the DAO layer, we have implemented through the JPA, which I'll be talking into the next tutorial. Okay, so but this is what the flow is, that we are calling through a request. The request can be either get or post. Then it's going to the controller, it's going to the dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet knows which controller to invoke, so it sends to the particular controller. The controller then receives the parameter if we are submitting from the UI, and then it tells that the next phase is it tells that which controller it needs to go to and which view it needs to go to. Then we do accordingly. So now if I go to the controller over here, model and view is resolved by dispatcher servlet. We already know that. The view takes the form of Spring view, which can be resolved by a view resolver. We already talked about this as well. The model is a map that allows multiple objects with key as name. Okay, and then there are some other Spring annotations, transactional, which we will be discussing when we are going to talk about the data layer. And then over here there is a brief description of what each of the annotation is doing. Okay, so that's all for today. Thank you.